History says Butch Cassidy died screaming in a Bolivian shootout in 1908. But 17 years later, in the autumn of 1925, his sister Lula Parker swore a stranger walked into her kitchen in Circleville, Utah. A stranger who knew secrets no outsider could know, who wore her brother's scars on his skin, and who calmly explained why the body in that Bolivian grave was never his. Today, we're going back to that grave, following the DNA and uncovering the truth behind what might be the greatest con. Butch Cassidy ever pulled, the San Vicente deception. The date was November 7, 1908. High in the Bolivian Andes, in a dusty mining outpost called San Vicente, perched roughly 15,000 feet above sea level, two American bandits were cornered in a cramped adobe house, 3 days after they'd robbed a mining company payroll. As the sun dropped and the air turned thin and bitter, Bolivian cavalry and local authorities ringed the shack. Gunfire exploded in the dark. Hours dragged past shouts, shots, then silence. Finally, 3 ragged screams tore out from inside, followed by 2 sharp gunshots. At dawn, soldiers pushed through the door and found 2 bodies, one man slumped against the wall, a bullet neatly punched into his forehead, the other sprawled on the floor. A single fatal wound in his temple. It looked like a grim final act of mercy followed by suicide. Local reports speculated that one outlaw had shot his dying partner to end his suffering, then turned the gun on himself. Within weeks, the story raced across South America and back to the United States. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were dead. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, which had hunted them across 2 continents, treated the tale as the perfect finale. The Wild Bunch was finished. The legend had its cinematic ending. But there was one problem that would haunt this version of events for more than a century. Nobody actually proved the bodies were theirs. A payroll courier named Carlos Pero, the man they'd robbed, identified the corpses as his assailants. But he had only ever seen those bandits through cloth masks, just their eyes peeking out. Bolivian authorities didn't know the dead men's real names. No photographs were taken. The 2 Americans were buried quickly in unmarked graves in the San Vicente cemetery, supposedly near the grave of a German miner named Gustav Zimmer. For most people, that was enough. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid died in Bolivia in 1908. Case closed. But cracks appeared almost immediately. Rumors swirled that the outlaws had slipped away yet again. Friends and relatives in Wyoming and Utah claimed they'd seen Butch alive years after the Bolivian shootout. Even the Pinkertons seemed unconvinced. William Pinkerton reportedly dismissed the San Vicente story as unreliable and never officially closed the hunt for Cassidy. For 17 years, these were just hushed stories and barroom whispers, the kind of folklore that wraps itself around every famous outlaw. And then came 1925, and those whispers crashed head-on into the Parker family's front door. Before we go any further into this Wild West rabbit hole, if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive storytelling, hit that subscribe button. I've got dozens more mysteries lined up, from Billy the Kid and Jesse James to the unsolved legends that still stalk the Old West, and you don't want to miss them. And while you're here, drop a comment with your theory about what really happened to Butch. I read every single one. Lula Parker Betenson was 41 when, according to her brother walked back into the family home in Circleville, Utah. She had been born 18 years after Robert Leroy Parker, later known to the world as Butch Cassidy, which meant she was just a little girl when he left home to become an outlaw. Her childhood memories of him were faint, but she later said she recognized him instantly when he stepped into that kitchen. 50 years later, at age 90, Lula broke a family oath and published Butch Cassidy, My Brother, where she described that 1925 visit in striking detail. The man called himself Bob, the name the family had always used. He pulled up in a brand new Ford and walked in wearing the familiar Parker grin everyone remembered. He stayed for 3 weeks. During that time, he told stories only Butch Cassidy should have known. He talked about robberies the family had only heard whispers about, filling in details they'd never been sure of. He named old partners and enemies from the outlaw trail. He pointed to scars on his body and explained how he got them, and according to Lula, they matched the injuries Butch had collected in his Wild Bunch days. Most importantly, he told them why the world believed he was dead. He said a friend named Percy Seibert had identified the bodies in San Vicente as Butch and Sundance, even though Seibert knew better. Percy Seibert was a mining engineer in Bolivia in 1908 and a friend to both outlaws. According to the story Butch told his family, he had once saved Seibert and his wife's lives. When two unknown American bandits died in San Vicente, Seibert saw a way to repay that debt. He falsely identified the corpses as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It was the only way, Butch said, that he could ever truly go straight. If the world believed he was dead, the Pinkertons would stop hunting him, the posters would come down, and he could finally move like a free man, maybe even return home. He made his family swear never to reveal his visit. He had started a new life and wanted to protect it. Lula and the rest kept that promise for half a century. When Lula finally went public in 1975, historians pounced. She was 90, recounting events that had happened 50 years earlier. Memory is fragile. Families are biased. To many scholars, her story sounded like wishful thinking or deliberate myth-making. But Lula wasn't alone. After her book came out, letters arrived from across the American West. More than a dozen people wrote to say they had seen or worked with Butch Cassidy after 1908. One name in particular kept surfacing, a machinist in Spokane, Washington, named William T. Phillips. Phillips died in Spokane in 1937. He was born in the early 1870s, making him roughly the same age as Butch Cassidy. In 1934, he wrote a manuscript titled The Bandit Invincible, The Story of Butch Cassidy. The book was supposedly a third-person biography about a man Phillips claimed to have known since childhood, but it was packed with details that felt too intimate for an outsider. It described events from Cassidy's life that weren't widely publicized at the time. It mentioned obscure people and remote hideouts only someone close to the Wild Bunch would know. One scene even described a judge visiting Cassidy in prison in February 1895, offering to seek a pardon, and Cassidy refusing, vowing to even the score someday in exchange, later confirmed in the letter preserved in the Wyoming State Archives. For decades, some historians were sure William T. Phillips had to be Butch Cassidy living under a new name. They pointed to physical similarities between Cassidy and Phillips, and to people in Wyoming who claimed they recognized Phillips as their old friend Butch. The theory fit nicely with Lula's story. Butch had told his family he was living in the Northwest under another name and had died there in 1937. Phillips died in Spokane in 1937. Case closed until new evidence ripped the theory apart. In 2009, a rare book collector in Utah bought a full version of The Bandit Invincible for about $12,000. It was nearly twice as long as the version historians had seen before. The expanded manuscript included new references and repeated mentions of a man named William T. Wilcox. Larry Pointer, the author who had championed the Phillips is Cassidy theory, started digging into Wilcox. What he found shocked him. Wilcox was a real outlaw who had served time in the Wyoming Territorial Prison in the 1890s for burglary and forgery at the same time Cassidy was imprisoned there for horse theft. The men knew each other, they rode together, they shared stories. When Pointer compared prison records and old photos of Wilcox with photos of Phillips, the resemblance was undeniable. William T. to story. Phillips and William T. Wilcox were the same person. In 2011, Pointer did something extraordinary. He publicly admitted he'd been wrong. Phillips was not Butch Cassidy. He was William Wilcox, a former outlaw and friend of Cassidy's who had borrowed Butch's life story and wrapped it around his own. Wilcox had changed his name to Phillips, married in Michigan in 1908 under false information about his parents, and reinvented himself as a machinist in Spokane. But the lure of the old days never left him. He wrote The Bandit Invincible to immortalize his famous friend and, very likely, to insert himself into that legend. At first glance, this revelation seemed to destroy the idea that Cassidy survived. If Phillips wasn't Butch, then who was? Here's where it gets interesting. Years earlier, Lula Parker Betenson had told Larry Pointer that her brother died in Spokane in 1937, but that he was not William T. Phillips. She knew about Phillips. She knew about the manuscript. She insisted he was someone else. The place and date lined up, she said, but the man did not. That opens a tantalizing possibility. What if Butch Cassidy really did survive and settle somewhere near Phillips in the Spokane area? What if the two former outlaws, Cassidy and Wilcox, crossed paths again in Washington state? What if Wilcox's manuscript was part biography, part confession, part stolen glory, using his friend's story as the foundation and weaving his own exploits into the mix? The questions multiplied. To answer them, investigators had to return to the cold, high graveyard in Bolivia. In 1991, legendary forensic anthropologist Clyde Snow led an expedition to San Vicente. Snow was known for identifying the remains of Nazi war criminal Josef Mengele and victims of mass killings around the world. If anyone could test the old story of Butch and Sundance's last stand, it was him. He was joined by historians Daniel Buck and Ann Meadows, who had spent years tracking the outlaws' trail through South America. Bolivian authorities granted permission to exhume the supposed graves in San Vicente's cemetery. The work was brutal. San Vicente sits at altitude so high that every step feels like wading through syrup. The air is thin. The wind is vicious. Sand and dust whip across the cemetery without mercy. Snow later said it was the most miserable sight he'd ever worked. An elderly villager named Fortunato Rios led them to the spot. He said his father had been present at the 1908 burial and had shown him exactly where the two gringos lay. The team dug. They uncovered two skeletons. One clearly did not fit either outlaw, based on age and physical characteristics. The other, though, was intriguing. Its age and size matched what they expected for the Sundance Kid. For a moment, it looked like they had the proof, the remains of at least one of the famous pair. Snow carefully collected bone samples for DNA analysis. Those samples were compared to DNA from living relatives of both Butch Cassidy, the Parker family, and Sundance, the Longabaugh family. To improve accuracy, the team even exhumed Sundance's brother from a cemetery in Pennsylvania to obtain better comparative DNA. The tests were run, checked, and run again. The results were decisive. The skeleton did not match the Parker family. It did not match the Longabaugh family. It was neither Butch nor Sundance. Further work showed the remains almost certainly belonged to Gustav Zimmer, the German miner buried nearby. The grave that had been pointed out for years as the final resting place of America's most famous outlaw duo didn't hold either of them. Snow believed the real graves might be just a few feet away, misremembered by the aging villager. But the altitude, the cold, and rising tensions with local miners made further digging too dangerous and politically sensitive. The team had to stop. The truth stayed in the ground. To this day, no one knows exactly where the two men killed at San Vicente in 1908 are buried, or if they were truly Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid at all. So, what really happened? Here's what we can say with certainty. Two American outlaws did rob the Aramayo Mining Company payroll on November 3, 1908, stealing roughly 15,000 Bolivian pesos. Those same two Americans were tracked to San Vicente a few days later. There was a shootout. 2 men died. Beyond that, everything blurs. The corpses were never positively identified by anyone who had personally known Butch or Sundance. No photos exist. The graves were not properly marked. And when scientists exhumed the supposed grave 83 years later, they found someone else entirely. Meanwhile, in the United States, credible witnesses insisted Butch Cassidy lived on. His sister Lula described a 3-week visit in rich detail, conversations, physical descriptions, family secrets that checked out. His nephew Bill Betenson documented around 20 post-1908 sightings. Former girlfriend Josie Bassett said she saw him. Ex-Wild Bunch member Elsie Lay claimed the same. Joyce Warner, daughter of outlaw Matt Warner, said Cassidy visited her and even sent her 3 letters under an alias, postmarked from Nevada mining towns. Could all of them be lying? Could all of them be mistaken? Where did Butch Cassidy pull off the greatest heist of his career, stealing his own death? Taken together, the evidence leans toward one conclusion. The DNA proves the famous San Vicente grave does not hold Butch Cassidy or the Sundance Kid. Multiple independent witnesses' family, friends, fellow outlaws claimed to see him alive years after 1908. Lula had no obvious reason to fabricate her story and waited 50 years to reveal it. Even the Pinkertons never fully embraced the Bolivian ending. According to Lula, Butch spent his final years somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, likely Washington or Oregon, and died in 1937 at around 71 years old. She wrote that where he is buried and under what name is still their secret, adding, "All his life he was chased. Now he has a chance to rest in peace, and that's the way it must be." If Lula's telling the truth, then Butch Cassidy died the one way an outlaw isn't supposed to die, of old age, quietly, after going straight. He got the ending every gunslinger dreams of but almost none achieve. He escaped. He reinvented himself. He lived long enough to watch his own legend grow while he watched from the shadows. The San Vicente shootout wasn't his tragic last stand, was his exit strategy, a carefully arranged deception that finally bought him a normal life. Percy Seibert's false identification wasn't a blunder. It was a final gift from a grateful friend. And somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, in an ordinary, unmarked grave, lies the real Butch Cassidy, the man who robbed trains and banks across the West, fled to South America, and then did something even harder than outrunning posses and Pinkertons. He vanished, and Butch wasn't the only member of the Wild Bunch to disappear. His ruthless partner, Kid Curry, pulled off an escape that might be even more unbelievable. Was he really killed in that Colorado shootout? Or did he fake his death just like Butch? I've got that story coming up next, and trust me, you won't believe how he might have done it. If you love diving into this mystery, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter in the Wild Bunch saga. And tell me in the comments, do you think Butch really made it home to Utah in 1925? Or did he die in Bolivia after all? I read every comment, and I can't wait to see your theories.